So, as James alluded to, I'm going to talk to you about, it's called the Elliott report, which is, I always thought was a coincidence because that's my surname. I don't know who chose the name for it, but I just want to talk through the backdrop to what happened, some of the things that went wrong, some of the recommendations that I made to the UK government, but then it's about what's happening now and what can happen in the future to make things more difficult for fraudsters to operate in the food industry. So it goes back to January 2013 when the scandal broke. First of all, it started with what looked like a small problem that had originated on the island of Ireland, then it spread to the UK, but then spread right across Europe. And what unfolded was that the red meat supply system in Europe had been penetrated by criminal networks. Now, what I'd like to do is first of all give you a little bit of information about what went wrong. And the first scandal that broke was the Tesco beef burger, the famous beef burger that had 29% horse meat in it. And Tesco's had sourced that meat from a meat company in the Republic of Ireland, and the contract between that supplier and Tesco's was to supply only Irish or British beef. And because of commercial pressures, what that company decided to do was to not fulfill the obligations of that contract, but rather to source cheaper meat from somewhere else in the world. And where they sourced it from was Poland. So they bought what they thought was beef, imported it into Ireland, made the burgers and sent them to Tesco. Somewhere along that supply chain, the cheating happened. So now we're 2.5 years after the incident, and the Polish blame the Irish blame the Polish, and it was actually, the fraud was probably perpetrated in Holland, because that's where the meat stopped, and I think that's where the fraud actually happened. Difficult to prove, except that there's one guy called Willie Selden, who was a big meat trader. Willie Selden couldn't join us today because he's in prison. He sent his apologies, and he's in prison for 2 years because he was part of the horse meat fraud in Holland. Now, the second fraud that lots of people talk about is the famous Findus lasagna. 0% beef, 100% horse meat. Now, Findus had a contract with a company called Comigel in France, and Comigel were meant to supply the beef to Findus. But for commercial pressures, Comigel subcontracted it to another company called Tavola, who then subcontracted it to another company called Spanghero, who then subcontracted it to a meat trader in Cyprus, who then subcontracted. What had happened was a supply chain had got out of control. Nobody knew really what was going on, and everything was being driven by cost, by price. Now, as a result of this, in April of this year, 27 people from 5 different countries were arrested by Europol for major fraud.